Hello there everybody and welcome to what is another video I can't believe I'm recording. Anthony joining you once again, and this video is a continuation of looking back at every card in the Transformers TCG since Wizards of the Coast has announced the game is ending. I talk a bit more about this in my video on the top 10 battle cards, which I'll have a link to in the description. But today we finish things off by looking at the top 10 characters. Now, like with the battle cards, I'll be looking at how powerful a character was in terms of its base offerings, but I'll also be basing this list on how much play each character saw, since better characters were more likely to have seen more play because of their power, as well as how consistently a character functioned. And like last video, I tried to be as objective about this as possible, but my opinion may have slipped in again, so feel free to disagree with me or anyone else in the comments, as long as you don't start going after anybody. As for which characters will be allowed on the list, everything is on the table, including combiners, so without any further delay, let's get this thing rolling. Now, at number 10, we have something I have a feeling might be controversial in Raider Tailwind, but hear me out on this one. Micromasters were naturally weaker than normal because of their small physical size, and while most Micromasters weren't exactly the best attackers because of this, Tailwind was a pretty notable outlier, as the condition to trigger the attack boost in his alt mode was fairly manageable, since pretty much every deck ever I've seen after Wave 2 had at least a few green icons floating around, making him a 5-attack Micromaster before flipping any orange icons. The defense boost wasn't a slouch either, despite him only being 2 defense once you actually got it off, but that still isn't too bad once you remember his stealth while untouched skill. He has an alt mode as well, and that was pretty much around all the time, since you never flipped him into bot mode unless you had other airstrike patrol members around, such as with the Prime airstrikes list that use Night Flight and Stormcloud along with a Prime. So you essentially keep him from getting hit by your opponent around, I don't know, 80% of the time if you attacked with him at the most opportune time. And while his bot mode skill was used every so often in those various Prime airstrikes lists, it wasn't as powerful simply because of how good the alt mode is. However, that doesn't push him any farther up the list, as he still is a Micromaster and can get destroyed fairly easily and fairly quickly with 1 or 2 misplays. But for his cost, he's a fairly decent attacker, and plus, he's really the only Micromaster that I can think of that saw a lot of independent play without other team members nearby, so that he has that going for him. At number 9, we have a tie between the 2 most powerful glass cannon characters, those being Ransack and Wave 1 RC. Simply put, these 2 offered some of the most offensive firepower for such low costs, with RC costing 5 stars and Ransack costing 6. However, their power came from different sources, with Ransack taking the damage dealt to him and turning it right back on your opponent, while RC didn't have a high attack, but rather guaranteed all attack points she did have would go through with her bot mode skill. On top of that, while they weren't the focus of the characters, their alt mode healing effects were nice bonuses, with RC's being one of the better spread repair effects, while Ransack's just made him charge up quicker in addition to any attacks he takes, as well as any self-damage cards like One Shall Stand, One Shall Fall, or Cayman Crash. On top of that, he was actually a fairly decent I Still Function candidate, since if he goes down, you can bring him back for a turn with a full attack of 7. Now, the reason I put them down here on the list is despite them being great on offense, their defense kind of stinks. RC has only 9 health and 1 defense, and I already mentioned how 8 health with 1 defense on Tailwind could be a problem at times. As for Ransack, while he did have 3 defense in bot mode, you generally wanted him to stay around 6 damage in order to make sure his attack was at least decent, and because of his 8 health, if you had 1 bad defense flip, he was toast. Then again, they weren't too much of an investment on your team, but it's still a noteworthy point to bring up. Number 8 is easily the best 5 cost the game saw with Flamewar. While RC was a glass cannon and thus was kind of a priority target, Flamewar wasn't exactly the most pressing offensive threat ever, and Bold 1 Tough 1 spread may have not seemed that good. However, while Bold 1 or Tough 1 given to a single character is never that good, spreading Bold 1 and Tough 1 is actually fairly good. I can't really explain why that is, though. It just is. And while you could go straight after Flamewar right away, that would leave whatever attacker she was paired with to go after you however they feel like, and this was most often seen with Optimus Prime Battlefield Legend, as in the beginning of competitive play, the most popular deck was the trio of Flamewar, OPBL, and Wave 2 Hot Rod. Of course, the weakness here is she's pretty weak on defense, and the 10 health isn't the most optimal, but the strengths and allowing for other characters to be run with her due to her cost easily make up for it. Number 7 was a decent support character in Lionizer. Now, while Bold 1 on a single character was bad, anything above Bold 2 on a single character was great. Bold 4, though, was nuts, and while the zero attack in bot mode wasn't the most ideal thing in the world, Demolisher had the same issue and it never seemed to be a problem with him. You can't really say too much else for bot mode, but weapon mode is where things get interesting. Putting Bold 4 on any character is nuts, as I just mentioned, and the only other 3 cards that could get close to this or match it are Superior Cannon, which required tech research and is kind of clunky, Dino Chomp, which offered Bold 5 but scrapped your whole hand and can only work on Dinobots, and Jurassic Punch, which gives Bold 14 at the minimum but requires Volcanicus to even be functional, and Volcanicus isn't exactly the easiest combiner to play. Lionizer does cost 7 stars, but it essentially gives you a lead defender, then allows you to immediately gain the Bold 4 once he's KO'd, and the Plan 1 is a nice bonus. Of course, there is the obvious issue of your opponent trying their hardest to avoid KOing him until later, and if that does happen, you were kind of screwed. But it's easy to avoid happening unless you have no experience with Battle Masters, so that's why he's here on the list. At number 6, we have one of the more hyped up cards for when the game first came out, Grimlock. Now, his alt mode skill is already great, even if it only works for Dinobots, as we've discussed how any bold value over 2 is great. Plus, his stat lines aren't too shabby either. As for bot mode, this is what really puts him up here with the best. Now, I think we all know how annoying it is when you accidentally overkill a character, and Grimlock is the only character who naturally prevents that. Sure, any character can do it with Steamroll, but Grimlock's is much easier to work with. Now, the reason he's here for me is that while you could play him outside of a Dinobot deck, and pretty decently I might add, he really excelled in a Dinobot deck, so I had to take both into account, and that's why he's at the middle of the pack when it comes to the list. Number 5 is definitely the card that perfectly mixes power and annoyance, that being Lord Megatron. Now, why is that? Well, let's go down a list. High defense? Check. High health? Check. Access to hunker down and composite armor from being a tank? Check. High attack? Kind of. Unique, powerful skills? Check. Now, the skills are definitely the highlight here, and here's why. If you've played virtually any other trading card game, you'll know that decking out or running out of cards in your deck is a common win condition for your opponent, and with the flipping mechanic in Transformers, having decking out as a loss condition would have cost 5-minute games to happen on the regular, so the devs likely had to avoid that in order for the game to be functional in any capacity. As such, having an effect that punishes your opponent for reshuffling is huge, as it's the closest thing to decking out we have in the game, and it's something that happened on the regular considering how much bold many of the top decks spammed. And of course, to make matters worse for the player on the other side of this card, his alt mode skill scrap cards from the top of the deck, and that could be made even more annoying via composite armor or emergency barricade. Now, the thing that puts him at the bottom of the top 5 is that I feel there's a slight bit of predictive play needed to maximize his bot mode skill, but I feel that learning curve is likely relatively small, so that's why he's here instead of farther down on the list. Number 4 is the only combiner on this list, making it the best combiner in the game, Sky Shadow. While other combiners suffered from odd combination mechanics or having to work with 5 or 6 characters to combine, Sky Shadow is the most straightforward combination mechanic. Simply get one of the 2 pieces KO'd and you can combine. No enigmas, no getting rid of cards, just get KO'd and combine. Not only was that an easy condition to work with, but it also allowed you to use one of the 2 pieces as a damage sponge for whatever character you paired with Sky Shadow to ensure that they didn't get completely destroyed early on. Once you were in combiner mode, you had the stats of OPBL, minus 4 health due to the way combining works, and you had a fairly decent set of skills. Bold 2 and Tough 2 aren't too exciting but effective, and the 3 damage was nice, but it only worked against Autobots, so it was hit or miss depending on what you were up against. But even with the skills being decent at best, the raw firepower he could put out was nuts. His defense was also decent, and you had an extra shot with Ominous once the main body went down. At this point, I'll mention that if your opponent was skilled or lucky enough, they could kind of go around that damage sponge thing I mentioned earlier, and him only starting with 10 health kind of sucks, but you got to admire what this beast can do with very little help. Now we're getting to the characters where if you saw them, you pretty much knew it was going to be a hell of a fight. At number 3, we have Nemesis Prime. Pretty much take everything I said about Megatron and apply it here. The stat lines are nuts, the abilities are great, and while you don't have all the tank tricks that Megatron gets, Nemesis simply doesn't need them. Just run a decent amount of bold and you'll get his bot mode skill working pretty quickly. And unlike Perceptor, who has a similar skill, you only need 1 or 2 cards to get Nemesis charged up, and sometimes you don't even need any. Plus, the alt mode skill is a nice touch, even though he probably didn't need any more firepower. The downside is he is 12 stars, but that's something that never seemed to be a problem when people used him, so that's why he cracks the top 3. Number 2 is another tie being between General Prime and Galaxy Prime. I honestly couldn't decide which was better, so I just decided to go with this tie for number 2. Now, both are great, but not for the same reasons. General Prime was a halfway decent offensive threat in his own right, but his alt mode skill was really what set him over the top. We already talked about how good Bold 1 or Tough 1 spread was with Flamewar, so both at once was amazing, and this proved to be true with a few different teams, such as the Prime Airstrikes archetype I mentioned that paired Optimus with 3 members of the Airstrike Patrol, and that worked really well with this, surprisingly enough. As for Galaxy Prime, he was not necessarily support with some power, and was just more raw power. The stats are nuts, the cost isn't as bad as one would think, despite being the highest on a non-combiner or Titan, and the skills are just crazy as crazy as the stats. I cannot speak all of a sudden. 3 utility slots aren't too interesting, but it does open up room for health boosts and other smaller shenanigans, and the extra action and upgrade plays are always great, especially considering the upgrade thing could just run off Matrix of Leadership and you're good to go. But if you've played this game at all, you'll know that it's obvious that while those primes are great, it's Optimus Prime Battlefield Legends that takes the top spot. Great stats? Check. Cost? Manageable, as we saw with it being paired with Flamewar and Hot Rod. Great skills? Double check. That extra action play was always impactful every time I used it on him, and I'm sure many would agree with me on that one. And the alt mode was surprisingly effective and kind of useful despite the bot mode being the main piece. There's not really much more to say that I haven't already said about this card, so I won't dive into that. That being said, if you want to know more, check out my video on the top 10 characters from the first 3 waves that I did a little under a year ago, and I'll explain more about that. And with that, we've reached the end. I already mentioned this in the battle card video, but not having this to talk about is going to suck since these videos were some of my best, both in quality and video performance. Hell, even the video that just went up when I'm recording this is my best performance I've had in the first day of a video being up so far, with 13 views and possibly a couple more at this point. Now, really the only other thing I can say in regards to that is that if you were here for my Transformers content, I still plan on playing it on serious competition every so often, so I hope you'll stick around for that. But even with that, I do hope you stick around for the other content we're putting out, because we're just trying to appeal to as many people as possible, and I hope you'll stick with us for that reason. That's really all I could say, except it's been a good run with this game. The releases were great, the community was great, and it's just a shame that this is now unfortunately a ghost of games past. Goodbye, Transformers. New releases may have stopped, but you will never be forgotten.